what frameworks are we looking at, right? And so this book specifically, me being a scholar myself, wanted to push the boundary and see, once we look at frameworks that have been established for us by someone else, do those frameworks work for the region, the people, and the area that we are studying, right? So, for example, for this book project, I was looking at Pakistani women legislators in the National Assembly. I realized that women's lived experiences in Pakistan are very different than women's lived experiences in other parts of the world. And so maybe that framework does not fit in with what we can actually observe and reflect on. And so this book is really a call to young scholars to push the frameworks, to create your own frameworks, and don't be afraid to do that.
Assalamu alaikum everyone and welcome. I have my co-host here, Qazi Ahmad Qasmi, the civil servant. He secured 20th position in CSS 25 in written and third highest score in interview. He is now allocated to PAS, Pakistan Administration Services. Ahmad, welcome as co-host. And now it's up to you.
So it's a matter of immense honor and privilege for us to be having two towering intellects, Dr. Rehana Saeed Hashmi and Dr. Ameena Zia of Brevard College. I guess I'm pronouncing it right, ma'am. Is it Brevard or is it Brevard?
Brevard, thank you.
Brevard. Yes, I'm personally and eternally indebted to both these figures because they have had an immense influence in shaping the contours of my own academic life and outlook. We would like to begin first of all with Dr. Ameena Zia. Without further ado, Dr. Ameena, if you were to boil down the major arguments that you make in the book, what would, let's say, some 5 to 6 key takeaways be that you would like to mention?
Thank you so much. First of all, I just want to thank everyone for being here and for having this amazing platform. Um, so, when we talk about my book at its core, it started with a deceptively simple question, which was what happens after women gain seats in parliament? And we know that so much of the conversation around gender quotas focuses on numbers, right? So, for example, how many women are elected and whether quotas actually increase these women's presence in political institutions. So
Sorry, but your
those
video is
questions,
on.
so many of these questions remain. So we have presence of women in parliaments, but what does that translate into? Does that translate into substantive representation? Meaning, does that actually translate into more legislation and more opportunities available for women? So that's the simple question that I wanted to ask, and that's what the book is about. And so I have to say that, through my journey with trying to unpack this central argument, it was really important for us to look at gender quotas specifically as being able to open doors and create access. Um, but we know that numerical representation alone does not actually mean that women's interests are being served or they're being advanced. And so the main important takeaway was that we cannot look at numbers alone. Another important aspect of the book that I find very intriguing myself is that we also uncovered that women are not single unified political group, right? So women legislators come from many different political parties. They come from different social classes, regions, and even ideological backgrounds. And all of these are things that factor into their experiences, how they shape their priorities once they come into office. Um, and so, what does representation really mean? So then we understand that
Sorry for
representation is so much.
interrupting you.
So yes, so when we look at, women legislators, we understand that they're not a monolithic group, right? They're very diverse, and what they represent is also more complex. So we found that, of course, we know that institutions matter, and the effectiveness of these women legislators then are shaped by the political parties, right, and the parliamentary procedures and also broader structures. So another takeaway was that systems matter and institutions matter, but where are the women placed within these structures and institutions, right? So in many cases, women either enter these institutions that were not originally designed for their participation in mind, right? Um, but how do we make sure that we have spaces that will accommodate women? So again, another takeaway is that, again, numbers, increasing the numbers alone, just saying we have X amount of percentage of women in parliament does not necessarily mean that there are systems, right? So the systems need to be adaptive to these women leaders. And another thing that also stood out in the research for this particular book was how active and influential are these women parliamentarians? So, do they contribute to, for example, legislation? Are they contributing to active debates or are they passive participants? Also, advocacy, which is something that's overlooked because advocacy tends to focus more on community organizing. So are these women leaders actually engaging in advocacy for women's interest? So that's another thing that's very important to look at, and yet many of these women are doing significant work that doesn't always receive attention or the attention that they deserve. So these are very different elements that we need to make sure that we also look at, moving again beyond just the numbers. And also, I would like to say that another lesson from this book project of mine, which is especially important to me as a scholar, was that we shouldn't be afraid as scholars. We should not be afraid to challenge and to expand the existing frameworks, right? So, for example, much of the literature on political representation today has traditionally been organized around descriptive and substantive representation, which is also what I look at. Okay, so again, looking at, when we look at women's representation, are we looking at what frameworks are we looking at, right? And so this book specifically, me being a scholar myself, wanted to push the boundary and see, once we look at frameworks that have been established for us by someone else, do those frameworks work for the region, the people, and the area that we are studying, right? So, for example, for this book project, I was looking at Pakistani women legislators in the National Assembly, and I wanted to use the frameworks and parameters that were set by international standards. But then I very quickly realized that women's lived experiences in Pakistan are very different than women's lived experiences in other parts of the world. And so maybe that framework does not fit in with what we can actually observe and reflect on. And so this book is really a call to young scholars to push the frameworks, to create your own frameworks, and don't be afraid to do that. For example, in my understanding of what does women's representation in Pakistan mean, I came up with this idea that I want to bring in poetry and I want to bring in um, writings and news articles and op-ed pieces into understanding what women's representation really means. And I have explicitly used Kishwar Naheed's work in trying to analyze the time and lived experiences of women. I have used many others. Patricia Hill Collins talks about, there are different matrices of power and leadership. And so just borrowing from different sources have created a way to understand what representation means, so that I could look at what is happening beyond just data and statistics, right? So looking at a more qualitative lens. And so that's something that I am very proud of as a researcher, especially in this book, because this book is really about pushing those boundaries.
Right, that's amazing. So if I understand like your argument correctly, you're trying to sort of, if I may be allowed the expression, postmodernize the discourse. Because as I analyze like the discourse on gender quotas, for instance, in Pakistan, what I see is that the discourse tends to unfold in like reductionist, modernist binaries, like either or propositions. Like somebody, on the one hand, a scholar is positing the question as to whether or not there should be quotas. Another scholar is counter questioning and saying no, there should not be quotas, but you kind of like grab the readers by the collar and compel them to ask the question as in whether or not we were asking the right question in the first place to begin with. So you try to like take the readers like beyond those like reductionist frameworks and those like binary propositions. Are we understanding your arguments correctly for the readers who are unfamiliar with the contents of the book?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that's a wonderful way to rephrase it. A lot of times, especially in academia, we are relegated to these spaces, and these buzzwords. But we have to be mindful, where are these buzzwords coming from, who's creating them, and what was the context that they were utilized in. That doesn't necessarily mean that those frameworks and parameters will work for Pakistan specifically, right? Or for any region, or any group of observation that you're leading. And so that is absolutely correct. And I think that, Pakistan is such an interesting case study because it's a relatively young country, young nation. And it's a nation that has gone through a very checkered history with leadership and power dynamics and access and visibility and voice, and whose voice is represented and whose voice matters, right? And so, but also that's very common for other comparable countries to Pakistan around the world. So it's not a unique case study. So when I was looking for this book specifically at women parliamentarians in Pakistan through a 10-year time period, it's a longitudinal study. I needed to change my framework because the frameworks of Hannah Pitkin talks about, for example, she has this amazing framework that is a starting point for representation, substantive, symbolic, descriptive, etc. Well, that framework wasn't enough. And then there are other frameworks that are regarded as liberal frameworks of progressive academia that look at women legislators or women leaders especially women leaders. Well, those were not enough either, right? So something was missing, and so yes, these frameworks are wonderful for a starting point, but as a researcher, as a scholar, we also have to look at, is this framework fitting the question that I am asking or the question that I am seeking to research and investigate? And that's where I encourage students and um, emerging academia scholars to please push that envelope. If something doesn't fit in perfectly, find a way, create your own framework, please, because that is the only way that we will advance our knowledge and understanding of what it is that we're studying, right? So because we could study a question, but if that question doesn't really fit into the mold, then it doesn't matter what your responses are, correct? And then we're not going to bring about change. So from a professor standpoint, I am very much in favor of critically thinking and pushing the envelope.
Right. Okay. One final question, and I would like you to keep the answer like short and succinct. Then we'll move on to Dr. Hannah. So the question, as I read through your book, you write, I think on page 145, that purely statistical approaches have their own limitations. So you tend to point towards this idea of the inability of the inadequacies of methods that tend to quantify everything. And that reminded me of what the French philosopher René Guénon said. Like we moderns, we tend to be blinded to the qualitative dimension of things, and then we get to see the same framework and the same mindset and tendencies being reflected in the social sciences as well. So, to what extent do you think that we need like a holistic shift from a quantitatively driven and positivistic ensnared mindset towards more like qualitatively rich approaches by, for instance, involving poetry or philosophy or like traditional indigenous frameworks to which I would turn to later on?
Absolutely. Thank you for that amazing observation. So that is the crux of the book. As political scientists, have been trained to look at things from a very quantitative standpoint, right? Data matters, and absolutely data matters, but data doesn't tell the entire story.
And that's
So
especially true in the US, right? Where positivism is still this big thing.
absolutely, absolutely. And I've been trained here in political science, so that was always my trajectory. But I want to point out that it is very important to bring in interdisciplinary approaches, right? Bring in sociology, bring in anthropology, bring in literature, philosophy, absolutely. And all of these other areas of study as well, psychology, to try to understand the whole lived experience of especially individuals that we are trying to study. And in the case of this book, something I want to point out briefly is that I started looking at women's representation in Pakistan, but I had to take a step back and ask myself, well, how do I define women's representation in Pakistan? I can't define it the same way that I would define it if I was studying representation in other parts of the world. And so from that approach, that's what led me to try to look at poetry and art and reflective op-ed pieces that women leaders or women scholars were writing at that time, because a lot of time from that discourse, the academic discourse, we miss the lived experiences and the shared realities, because the numbers, the constitution, the rules, the legislation can reflect one side of the story, but we're missing an entirely separate side of the story, which is what are their actual realities and lived experiences.
Right. Thank you. So, Dr. Rehana, over to you. First of all, how do you view the question of gender quotas in Pakistan in general? And second of all, Dr. Ameena makes this point that yes, we need gender quotas and gender quotas are necessary, but in and of themselves, gender quotas are perhaps insufficient. So, do you agree with this like fundamental proposition? Like, do you think that yes, gender quotas were a necessary step forward, but relying on these quotas alone is perhaps insufficient. And perhaps we need to start analyzing like the operational output of these quotas and evaluating like the performance of the women who are actually being elected or selected for that matter on these reserved seats. So how do you view this entire issue?
Obviously, thank you very much, Ahmad. Dr. Ameena rightly pointed out in her, I do believe in that is very amazing work on gender quota, and especially studying Pakistan's legislature, National Assembly. Okay, I believe in that, yes, gender quota is important, but in the case of Pakistan, when we see gender quota, then usually we mix with number one, the gender quota, what gives the women. So the very much thing is that some people believes in that gender quota gives a presence of women in the legislature. So whatsoever I want to believe in, that we often mixes presence with the concept of power. So these two things have been confused. So either the women in Pakistan who are politically being representing in the National Assembly, they want presence only, or actually they want to exercise power. Here, power means that the effective representation within the parliament. So as far as the presence is concerned, then I think that the number is sufficient, because they are I can say descriptively that they are very much visible within the parliament. But as far as the power is concerned, as far as their role is concerned, the efficient representation is concerned, I have so many questions on this, because here we can say that there is a lack of substantive representation of the gender quota in Pakistan. So this is the one answer of your first question. The second one is that obviously, as Dr. Ameena, she has pointed out that we have certain kind of frameworks for theoretical frameworks, and in which we try to fit in our case studies. And obviously, when we political scientists, we are working on our theoretical grounds and or any kind of case studies, then we often look at the West and what type of studies, what type of theoretical considerations they have designed for us. We try to fix our case studies within it. So the cultural requirement of Pakistan, the political requirement of Pakistan, and the social requirement of Pakistan are entirely different to the Western world. So it is rightly suggested that we have to design our own frameworks, we have to design our own spaces in which we can say that this is the case study. But apart from all these things, there are some set standards and there are some general rules and regulations. And obviously, I will reiterate on the first thing which I have mentioned here, that the substantive representation, this is actually the common principle that is the general set standard on which we have to monitor the female legislators of the Pakistan. So I do believe that there are, apart from these two very important lenses that we have to check, that there are some certain standard rules that we have to follow. So one is the substantive representation, in which the all the legislators, they have to perform. So when we see Pakistan has one central legislature and we have 4 provincial assemblies. And in all the provincial assemblies, according to the legislation of 2002, all the political parties, they are bound to give special quota for the women's seats, and the women's are the part of their legislatures. But the important thing is that I do believe in that there are a kind of challenges in which the women legislatures, they have to substantially participate within the legislation activity. Because there we have seen that in all the political parties, they are not giving, this is very critical, this is very crucial, but this is the reality in Pakistan's politics, that all the political parties, they are not ready to give independence to the women legislatures, that they brought the bill about their own, that how the women, they have the actual issues within the society and how their issues could be resolved. So what could be the party agenda? I have seen that they are presenting that on the table, because when you see the legislature history of Pakistan, then you will see that in all the 4 provincial assemblies and in the central legislature also, there are certain, you can say, the bill which are being presented by the women legislature, but at that time, that is the party agenda. Like, we have seen that they used to work on workplace harassment. So that is the policy of the central government, and it is translated from the provincial government as well. And they make sure that the political party present that bill through a female legislature on the table. And then the legislation has been passed. And all the provinces and the central government, they have this. But as far as the execution is concerned, not even a single legislator, female legislator, has been raised the voices within the National Assembly or the Provincial Assembly, that why effective execution of the workplace harassment is not possible, because we have seen so many cases over there. So this is the one thing which is very challengeable, which is very critical, on which I think so that the female legislators, they are bound to follow the party decisions. So the second thing is also very important, because when we see that either on the quota system, the female legislatures, either they belong to a particular political dynasty, they belong to a political group, or they belong to a civil society. Like me, can I get a party ticket as a female legislator to contest and to be the part of that? Obviously not. If I am very much aligned with the party's manifesto and with the party's ideology, then of course they will give me the ticket and I will contest. But when I would be on that platform, obviously I have to keep in mind what are the party priorities and how the party, what the party needs from me to do this. So I think so that these are very important challenges that the female legislatures at this time, they are not performing their independent role, but their role is hijacked by political parties and the political parties' leadership as well.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, the first point that you're trying to make is that although women have gained like presence in the corridors of power, they have not yet gained the power to make effective use of that presence. And then the
Obviously
agendas tend to like dominate whatever legislative agenda they bring forth. and they do not have the necessary amount of autonomy or the independence that they need to effectively contribute to, women specific or health specific or education specific agendas and the like. But then, ma'am, you mentioned this idea of women legislatures who have been selected in reserve seats who come from political dynasties. But then, given the circumstances in which our current country is currently embroiled, do you not think that having no women at all would be like a much worse off option than having at least some women? Because there's this theory I'm working on called the matriarchal feudalistic politics model. So what we get to see is that, yes, there are certain women from feudal and political dynastic backgrounds who are getting elected or otherwise being selected in reserve seats. But then when they go back to their constituencies or whichever area that they belong to, if they're on reserve seats, they are trying to render certain services, for instance, for women, and they're working for education. Do you think that it could actually work off as a stopgap strategy? So unless and until we arrive at the position where we get actually women elected in general seats, having women from political dynasties elected or otherwise elected in reserve seats is something that we should be appreciating rather than condemning, because at least they're doing something for the women and something for their constituencies. So how do you see that?
It's a very good question, and that was the reason that initially I asked that yes, quota system, gender quota is good. This was the reason.
Right.
But the main thing is, as Dr. Ameena said earlier, that Pakistan is a young nation, almost around 80 years we have. And as far as democracy is concerned and the representation is concerned, it is also have almost half of the way, because we caught up with so many other systems as well, the authoritarian regimes, and we have the hybrid type of democracy, we had martial laws, we have so many other things. So in this journey, which was not very smooth as far as the democratic traditions or democratization is concerned, so in which I do believe that yes, this is a kind of hope. It gives hope that obviously when we will cross all these hurdles, and gradually when the young minds and young people like you, those would be vigilant and cautious, that obviously at the end we would achieve that thing that is actually at this time the ultimate goal and the hope and the beacon through which this quota system was introduced. I hope so, because I am very positive at this side, because that when they introduced the quota, then they had very much in their mind that the 45% at that time who the women were, that they must be in the power corridor. So at this time, some people believe in that the women are, the ratio of women population is almost not the 60%, but it is around 52 to 53% at this time. So gradually, as we will move forward and as the democratic norms and values would be the part of our political system, then I hope so that so many people who would think alike, so many women who would be also the part of this system, and they will try to change these norms which are objectionable. Yes.
Right. Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Ameena, back to you. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yes. So in the book, you write, and I quote, effective strategies for increasing women's political participation must be locally grounded, and that the narratives that drive these changes must be crafted and supported within the local context. So do you think that, for instance, the inclusion or incorporation of, for instance, indigenous thematic cultural motifs, or for that matter, religious motifs, do you think that it could actually turn out to be useful? Because currently, if I were to analyze the present situation, I see that everybody who's working for or against women empowerment, they're operating in silos. So those, for instance, who are on the left of the ideational spectrum, they tend to demonize those who are on the right. and vice versa. So, do you think that that borrowing strategy, like borrowing from those on the other side of the ideational aisle, do you think that that could lead to a less polarized and a more effective strategy? And do you think that for instance, the slogans that are currently being employed, given the conservative society that we are, they are actually turning out to be self-defeating strategies? So could there be like incorporation of religious motifs or like indigenous cultural frameworks for that matter? Could that lead to more effective strategies?
Thank you for that question. That's a wonderful question. And I want to build on what Dr. Rehana Hashmi also mentioned is that, you know, let's take a step back and define what it is that we're looking to investigate. So I want to build on what Dr. Rehana Hashmi also mentioned that, you know, when we're looking at substantive representation, we look at, are these women in the power corridors, as she mentioned? Are these women participating in parliamentary procedures? Are these women part of the broader structures of the party system, the political party system, which is, of course, you know, a gateway to political participation in democratic institutions. So when we look at just those things, we realize that yes, we do have numbers in Parliament, and I completely agree with Dr. Rehana Hashmi. But then, are these numbers really leading us to see change in the system? So that's what we're looking for. Are we changing the system? And what that means is, are we making the system more accessible to women? I don't like to use the word inclusive to women, but accessible, right? Because these spaces are open to everyone. But in Pakistan currently, these spaces are very male dominated spaces. So I want to point out, especially something in my book that I found was absolutely we have more women being represented in parliament. Well, what did that mean in reality? Well, during my conversations and interviews with parliamentarians, they told me when we first got to the Parliament House, they only had one bathroom. They didn't even have a need for a separate bathroom for women. And so the first structural change that needed to happen for these women to even participate in meetings was that there needed to be another bathroom made for women. But the question came up, we don't why do we need this? We don't have the budget to do this. Why are we doing this? But you need to do, these are very basic things again, so that's systemic change, right? So are we changing the way that we have these spaces, because those spaces create opportunities? And so that was step one, and that happened. So does presence lead to substantive representation? Again, how are we defining substantive representation? In this particular case, it was successful because now there's a separate bathroom for women, right? In most of these spaces, whereas before there wasn't, or these spaces are now accommodating the idea that we do have to make spaces that are accessible, created, curated just for women. So in that way, yes, it's successful. And we also know that through symbolic representation, when you see more women in a place, it's likely that more other women will want to join in. But the reality in Pakistan is, now that's the idea of gender quotas, right? Gender quotas are a temporary stopgap. And I think we mentioned that earlier. Gender quotas are not supposed to be there forever. But what we should look at is, are we almost there to where we can get rid of gender quotas? And is there a pipeline for women to run for office, get party support, or even have financial support from their supporters? Have we created a space for all of this natural pipeline? And the answer is no, we have not, because that's where dynastic politics and political parties come to play, right? Because they're the guardians and safeguards of the party system, or of politics and power. So in that case, no, substantive representation has not achieved what it was supposed to with gender quota. So where do we need to tweak? Where do we need to tweak some of this? Does that help answer? Oh, and again, to your question about indigenous experiences and theology, religion, Pakistan is a country that is very much fused into religion. We cannot separate the two. What does democracy mean in Pakistan? You have to look at religion. You have to bring that in. You have to bring in indigenous experiences, because Pakistan is also lived outside of those urban areas, right? So how do we incorporate all of that? So that's why from my book, I talk about it's important to define what it is that we're seeking. Because if we define representation and descriptive and substantive representation, specifically, we cannot leave religion out. We cannot leave Indigenous experiences out. And we cannot leave these experiences of creating spaces.
Right. And if I were to play the role of the devil's advocate, you mentioned the term identity politics, and I know it's a loaded term, we're all familiar with that. And there is this abstract argument grounded in classical liberalism, for instance, that what gender quotas or any identity based politics does is that it tries to somehow foreground the collective identity over the individual identity of us being women or men or belonging to any ethnicity. So, what matters with identity politics, the critique goes, is that we forego our own achievement based identity, achievement based status over the ascriptive status of our gender or our ethnicity. And that turns to somehow undermine meritocracy for that matter. I mean, the likes of Dr. Jordan Peterson, they're pushing this agenda. I know the argument seems too abstract for a country like Pakistan, where the problems that we are facing are like the lack of basic facilities and bathrooms for that matter. But how would you respond to like such critiques who outright try to demonize the very idea of having gender or any quota for that matter on the sole proposition that they try to forward this idea of identity politics, and any form of identity politics in and of itself is inherently harmful. So how do you see those questions? Do you think that identity politics by necessity tends to undermine the idea of individual identity, meritocracy, and then the liberal idea of achievement status?
That's a very good viewpoint and a very good question. It's one that's going to take an entire webinar to discuss. But I want to briefly mention that, you know, again, in a country like Pakistan, quotas or any kind of special structures that are created for minorities is a stopgap. It is supposed to be. So when we look at the liberal frameworks that you mentioned, these are only stopgaps. These are only supposed to temporarily fix, because the hope is that eventually, especially with the third term, things will change, systems will change. And I come back to that. So yes, identity politics inherently, there is, as you mentioned, there is a thought process that says that they can harm the product itself. But in a country like Pakistan, how do you bring change then? Right? So we have to bring change by creating pathways. And gender quotas is a great example of identity politics, and it's a great example of trying to create a way to immediately increase the number of women in leadership positions. And so if we look at it as a way to create systems and access, then it's okay. But if we relegate gender quotas as a part of the Pakistani democratic fabric, that is very harmful, because it does sideline women into just, it relegates them into this one space. Well, this is a space, special space for you, special structure for you, and it's confined. We'll give you your own budget, we'll give you your own special things, where you're not mainstreaming women, right? So the idea is to mainstream women, not to keep them on the side, because that's what you're leading to, right? Because identity politics in this case, that's what would create that, which has happened in Pakistan. You have these quota system where, okay, we have to fill these quotas, we're done. We've given them their space, we've given them their subcommittees, we've given them their power, but this is the only limited power we have given them because it is special. Women don't need special powers. Women need systems that help them mainstream and act as active participants within the main system, not just relegating them to the side. And that, how do we get to that point? How do we cross that bridge in a country like Pakistan? Right. And so that's where the arguments come in. Well, from my book, from my observations in the book, my recommendation has been the individuals that are included in parliaments through gender quotas must have some connection with advocacy on the ground, because you have to have that connection in order to create systems to change. Because unless your system is changing, the gender quotas are not doing what they're supposed to. And at this point, having gender quotas in Pakistan for X amount of years, systems do need to change. And if they're not, well, let's redefine and let's relook at, well, what is it that we need to do? Or maybe gender quotas in Pakistan are not necessary. Maybe what is necessary is to create pathways in the political parties, which are the guardians of power and democracy in Pakistan. Well, maybe it's the political parties that need to also create opportunities to bring new people in, to provide support, and have spaces for women where they have their own political support systems, because we know that men around the world inherently have their own political support systems. Women do not. So maybe a better way to understand the dynamics of Pakistani women parliamentarians, or any politicians for that matter, would be, does the system exist at the very beginning? And maybe gender quotas should not be a part of that. So we don't know that unless we walk away from our frameworks that are mostly Western frameworks. We have to walk away from them and look at, well, what is working in Pakistan? What are the lived realities? A very quick example.
Do you think that the very construct, the very analytical construct of identity politics could actually be applied to Pakistan, or are we involving ourselves in a cognitive dissonance by using these words in these categories? Because
we should not be using these words. No, identity politics.
If I understand you correctly, there's this discrepancy between symbolic representation and substantive representation. And the purpose of gender quotas as a stopgap measure is to eventually bridge that discrepancy and bridge that gap. And in the absence of the bridging of that gap, we are using these stopgap measures. And secondly, if I'm getting your point right, we need constant vigilance. Like, just having quotas themselves would not solve our issues. What we need is constant vigilance and this feedback loop on how those women in reserved seats are actually performing. And that is the only viable way forward, if I understand you correctly, to lead to gender mainstreaming.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think we need stakeholder approach to leadership and to power dynamics and to democratic ideals in Pakistan. A stakeholder approach is where you bring in academia, you bring in legislators, you bring in civil society, and you also bring in activists and advocacy groups on the ground that are actually doing the reality, know the reality, and doing the work. Unless we bring everyone as a stakeholder to the table to kind of understand and even come up with the idea, well, where do we want women's representation to look like and to lead to, we can't get to it. Quickly, I want to comment on, you said, should we stop using these terms? Absolutely. When we look at identity politics, when we even look at the term, I know we haven't mentioned it today, but when we look at intersectional dynamics, intersectionalism was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in the US. And it was coined specifically for a certain group that was marginalized or not included in US politics. Now, we can't take that concept and bring it to Pakistan and say the same thing is happening, because the Pakistani women's lived experiences are not the lived experiences that Kimberly Crenshaw is talking about. Patricia Hill Collins, for example, when she talks about identity politics, she is talking about identity politics from her observations and ground realities of women in the United States. Now, apparently, it does have a broad stroke understanding of, hey, this is how it's a framework, this is how we can use, but they do not mean for other countries to adopt it exactly as is. Again, I will say, as I mentioned earlier, these frameworks are a starting point. They are meant to be to help us understand systems. How does the world work? How does our society work? How do we need to frame society? But in no way does that mean that that system is going to work perfectly for a Pakistani woman's lived reality. For example, a really quick example I want to give is that when we look at Pakistani financial inclusion, we look at GDP. Does the GDP include the women who are sewing at home, the women who are catering from home, the women who are running lots of their businesses from home, the non-traditional financial mechanisms? Absolutely not. So immediately we are not including women into that. But the lived reality of a Pakistani woman up and down the social ladder is that the Pakistani woman is an active contributor to society and in society.
And has all
But her contribution,
and has actually always been, especially in the agrarian societies. I mean, women were always part and parcel of the mainstream economic and social life.
absolutely. And but when we look at the numbers, we see that women are excluded because they're a part of the informal economy. So Pakistan has to then realize, what does financial inclusion look like for us? Because we do have a huge segment of population that is actively participating in the informal economy. So these frameworks that we're borrowing internationally do not reflect Pakistan's realities, right? So again, we need to be creative and push that envelope and come up with a definition and a framework that works for Pakistan. So again, it's the same concept, that where are the lived and shared realities of women? And if I can go a little further and even say that women in Pakistan are leaders in their own spaces. So how do we even define leadership? Within their households, within their communities, within their certain networks. Women don't need a relegated space, but they do need access. They don't need special treatment or special budgets, but they do need they need systems to create pathways and for them to access mainstream society. And I think that was one of the biggest takeaways from my book.
Right. Okay, we have 20 minutes left. I have to go back to Dr. Hanna. Dr. Hanna, can you listen to us?
Yes, obviously.
I would like to mention something entirely different. So, Dr. Ameena Zia writes in a book, and I quote, Pakistan was founded in the concept of political representation. Now, personally, when I read that line, I found it very intriguing at first. And to be honest, I've never come across a single line that dissolves this dilemma that we academics and students face when we try to understand the ideational imperative of Pakistan. So then she tries to connect the historical quest that we have in the pre-partition days for separate electorates, and she connects that to the quest for reserve seats for women. I mean, the logic underpinning both these quests are pretty much the same. That representation is an inherent right of each and every single group, and governments cannot be responsive without being representative. So how do you view the statement that Pakistan was, quote unquote, founded in the concept of political representation, and that the story of Pakistan is at its heart a story of representation? So I know that you have been teaching these and allied subjects for a significantly long period of time, and you have immense experience in teaching and studying these disciplines. So how do you see an inherent link, if we were to take the ideational imperative of Pakistan to its logical conclusion, we actually need a government that is inclusive of each and every single ethnicity, each and every single gender-based group, and each and every single communal identity. How do you view this statement? To me, it was very intriguing. It was like a moment of epiphany.
This is very, very important, Ahmad. But at the same time, I will say that we are at the path and we are moving towards that path in which we can say that our representation, it is all inclusive. But at this time, I am happy that women are the part of political system. At this time, I am happy that women are the part of bureaucracy. At this time, I am happy that women are the part of education system and they are contributing in all those areas. So gradually, as far as this identity politics is concerned and the effective representation is concerned, I think so that with the passage of time, as we will move forward, we will obviously, hopefully, we will get this. But I will say one more thing when Dr. Ameena was talking about the identity politics and all this, that women, they are very much conscious about the identity. because I have seen that there are some sort of issues over there when they become the part of politics, when they become the part of bureaucracy, even as I am the part of the higher seat of learning. So there are, when we see something happening not accordingly, then there are certain you can say that we want to do something for that. And this is actually very important thing for all, because I know so many parliamentarians. One of my students, she did PhD thesis on the women legislators in the Punjab Assembly, that, and we actually did that how they participated and in the development, in political development of the Punjab, that what type of legislation they did. And during that time, when we had a personal and the lived experiences with those female legislatures, then something comes across that they were not very much happy to the party policies, and not openly, but in the core committees and in the house meetings, they were very much, you can say that they look into tell them that this is right and this is wrong. So it means that being the part of the system, obviously at the very initial stage, they are not in a position to confront that system, but with their frequent intervention and penetration within the system, obviously they will do a kind of positive change as well. And like that, within the bureaucracy, I have seen, and I have reached out so many bureaucrats, female, who are actually want to develop positive change within that system. Because one thing, while doing all this discussion, we have to keep in our mind that within the political system, the overall system always support men. Within the education, the overall support system always support men. Within bureaucracy, they also have their support system. And so when within the short pockets where female bureaucrats, where female educationists, where female, you can say, workers, female participants, female, I know that the civil society workers, because they are humanitarian workers, and they are also performing and raising their voices for all other good things. When they have frequent participation, frequent penetration within the system, then obviously they will bring change. But within that time slot, I think so that it will take a little bit more time to reach at that stage, because at this time, the females, they are confronting with that ideational stance in which the traditional religiosity, they believe in, that women should not be the part of all that system. So obviously at one front, they are confronting with that whole narrative, and at the other side, keeping that religiosity with them, they are also penetrating within the system, and they also trying to contribute positively. So I think so that with the passage of time, things will go well. I think so, because gradually, when I see that I have so many students, obviously the young female students. So, and I almost 27 years have gone teaching Punjab University, and I have seen that there is too much change, especially the girls, their thought, their ideas are drastically changed. Now they want to contribute positively within the society, and their dreams are so high. And I think so that these pockets, small pockets, will give them more leverage, will give them more courage, and will give them more space to work positively within this. So obviously, yes, Dr. Meena, very well done I have also read your book, The Gender Quota in Pakistan's National Assembly. And one thing which I learned from your book that is that we should not see the numbers, but we should see that opening and that space which the Pakistani women achieved through this. So.
Right. Right. Ma'am, so if I'm getting your point right, you're making the argument that yes, the culture framework is slowly yet steadily changing, but stereotypes are like at present the main hindrance in the path to women's empowerment. And to
Yeah.
add a fun point here, actually, in the 2025 CSS exam, that is the Central Superior Services examination, which we take the bureaucracy, there were more women qualifiers in the written exam. So more women actually, for the first time in the history of Pakistan, qualified the written exam, which was, I think, like both
Sorry,
surprising.
they qualify for the written exam, but when you see the results of their interview, that was be drastically low.
Yes, but at least even that is like a ray of hope that if
Yeah,
I
obviously.
did notice that discrepancy that in the final list of allocatees, but we only had like 170 vacancies, but still a significant amount of women were able to make it into like mainstream bureaucracy. So I guess this would hope well. And Dr. Ameena, can you hear us?
I can. If I may, I have some points I would like to make based on Dr. Hashmi, if I may.
We have just 10 minutes, so if you could like briefly like summarize your points or anything you'd like to add.
Yes, so I really liked how Dr. Rehana Hashmi talked about, women leaders, women political leaders wanting to bring change, but then there was not a way to bring those changes, right? And that leads us back to our conversation about that is why creating systems that offer opportunities and offer spaces for women to do what they want to do is so important. So exactly to her point, having the number of women there, unless these women are able to really do anything, doesn't matter. So what we again need to look at through our scientific inquiry is that, are we asking the right questions? Are we defining things accurately? And are there, especially in this case, for this conversation's sake, are the pathways available for women to actively participate? So we have women, but are they actively participating? So now we're completely redefining what traditional substantive representation even means within this discussion, right? Another point I want to make is what you brought up, that Pakistan at its inception was politically an intentional project. Um, so the idea is, and I talk about that in an entire chapter in this book, where it is important for us to understand that there was a need for representation, and that is why Pakistan was created along those lines. So it was a very intentional movement, right? It was not an organic movement that happened and people culturally, socially, because Pakistan is an anomaly in that. So once we understand that, and once we begin from there as a starting point, so because Pakistan's creation was so intentional, so does the democratic project of Pakistan have to be intentional, where we do need to bring in stakeholders, like I said, religious stakeholders, as Dr. Hashmi mentioned, is very important to have them on board. So bring the stakeholders together to see, well, what kind of democracy is going to work for Pakistan to thrive, and so that we are inclusive, right, based on those ideal principles that the country was founded on. And that absolutely includes religious scholars. Once they're on board, that will help the mainstream society understand. So we cannot just live in these silos and bring in a liberal project and hope that gender quotas work, because gender quotas are just one small part of the puzzle, a very small piece. And another thing I want to quickly mention is that, Pakistanis belong to a very political community in general, socially, economically, culturally, right? So everything about Pakistan is political in nature, which means that any changes or any wants to change also have to be intentional. And so unless we have that intentional concept there, we're not going to see changes just through evolution. And I do quickly want to bring in that when we look at Pakistani women politicians, and I'm not just talking about parliamentarian, but just all politicians up and down the political dynamic. Okay, I'll just conclude in 1 minute. I did want to point out that when we look at women politicians in Pakistan, up and down the leadership ladder, women politicians in Pakistan have their own very unique way of representing. For example, when you look at the West, when we see women politicians um, in important spaces, they have kind of adopted a very male-dominated presence, right? And Hillary Clinton was known for her pantsuits, right? Angela Merkel was known for her very distinct style. Even Benazir Bhutto, a few decades back, was known for her very distinct style. But let's look at Pakistani female politician today. They are not relegated into those male-dominated, accepted visual representation of themselves, right? So when we look at Maryam Nawaz, when we look at Sherry Rahman, they are, and these are just Hina Rabbani Kar, they have reclaimed their own gender as part of politics, right? So they have mainstreamed themselves. Now I'm talking specifically visually. They are not relegating to, oh, I need to wear very male dominated, I don't need to act like a male representative to represent politics in my very male dominated space. So that, I want to point out, is very distinct from other female politicians around the world. And that in itself lets us know that the frameworks that we're using are not going to work for Pakistan, because we need to define what does a Pakistani female leader look like, and what does the Pakistani female leader represent within Pakistan, keeping indigenous cultures in mind and keeping religiosity in mind.
I will say that as far as the gender quota is concerned, and the standard and the frameworks are concerned, I will say that the Pakistani atmosphere is different and culture is very overpowering here. And same thing we can see with the concept of women empowerment, because the concept of women empowerment that we see abroad in the is entirely different, and the concept of women empowerment in Pakistan, because I believe in that gradually the women in Pakistan, they are enjoying empowerment, but within their own cultural context. So in the gender quota also, the cultural context is very much important. So gradually, when the culture will improve, when the culture will adapt the modern things and all other things in it, then obviously we will see that the women, they will also perform like that we see the women in the West.